Hello, everyone, and welcome back to my first proper episode of the Captive Raptors podcast. If you want to keep up to date with me and all the stuff that I keep, follow me over on Instagram at Paul's Monitors. So, this episode, we're going to do a deep dive into the Ackie monitor and how I care for them. The topics we're going to cover today, I've got my notes in front of me so I don't forget. Finding your Ackie, like from how and where to find it and make sure it's in good health. An overview of the species, how I set mine up, what lighting I use, what substrate I use, the humidity, the mental health and the enrichment of the animal, food and supplements, and taming your animal. So start off straight away by I'd recommend going to a good breeder, because then not only have you got a point of call to go back to if there's any issues or if you've got any questions, but then you know that you've just got peace of mind that their reputation sort of will uphold and your animals will be in good health. But in the event that you're not sure and you want to get it from a pet shop or maybe someone like myself, for example, I'm not a reputable breeder. I've only just started breeding, so things to check for and check on the eyes, make sure they're alert, and you can tell with monitors because the pupils sort of dilate. Make sure the eyes are nice and open and nice and alert. Check the toes and the claws. Make sure that the claws and the toes are sort of intact, not cut, no claws missing. You get the odd one, but the chances are if they're missing multiple toes, then the breeder either hasn't got correct humidity, or the chances are that its siblings have been nibbling away at it. Check it for muscle definition. It's easier to tell on an adult animal, but you can tell if the Akkie's alert and active, and you can see, especially in the males, they've got like the nice big forearms. So just check that the animal is nice and muscly and not fat. But on that, make sure it's got a nice belly on it, especially as a baby, because then you know it's been eating very well. But a fat Ackie, you're gonna get yourself a lot of issues. Again, that's mainly for adults, not babies. If there's poo in the enclosure, and if you're going to someone who's got multiple babies, the chances are there will be, as I'm learning myself. But the poo should be quite dark and small, in comparison to, say, the animal that shouldn't be like runny or a huge poo, as well as a small little white urate in comparison to the rest of the poo. So you should be able to see that. That's a good sign. If the animal's panting like a dog and it's got its mouth open when it breathes, the chances are it's got respiratory infection or some other issues. The movement, then check the way that it moves. Make sure that all the limbs are moving properly, the tail's moving properly, the neck's moving properly. If there's any issues there, the chances are that it's either got a fracture or a swelling, or depending on the age of the animal again, but it could have something like metabolic bone disease. Again, this is all just speculation, but it's just something to keep an eye on and check. And finally, the tongue, the most important feature of the monitor lizard. Make sure the tongue, it's got a good, nice flick to it. It's going to be hard to see on an animal that is a baby. The chances are it's going to be quite scared. And the tongue may not flick, but if it's an adult, the tongue should be flicking. It should be inquisitive. It should be curious. That's a good sign on a nice, healthy Ackie. So that was just a brief check over on how to check that your animal's healthy. But again, I would go for a reputable breeder or support your local breeders, and ideally go for someone who's going to basically be there for you and be able to aid you in every step of the way on how the on any issues that you may have, and the breeder can be there for you. So just a quick overview. In the hobby, we basically have red Ackies, which are, I'm going to butcher Latin, but Varanus acanthoris. We have yellow Ackies, which is Varanus acanthoris brachyurus, like the dinosaur. And then not common in the hobby, definitely not in the UK, Varanus acanthoris insulanicus. So we're just going to focus on red and yellow Ackies, but for me, I only keep yellow Ackies, so this is going to be dedicated for yellow Ackies, but the two are more or less applied the same. So just a quick overview on basically what the hobby is. So you have a red and a yellow Ackie, and that's just how we deem them. There's been multiple times where they've been the same and not the same genus, same subspecies. So, but for the most part, the yellows tend to be slightly meaner. Yellows tend to be slightly nicer, and the reds tend to be slightly meaner. And just checking my notes, make sure I don't get it the wrong way around. The reds tend to be slightly larger, and the reds, they look meaner as well. They have a almost like a cunning, evil face, whereas a yellow sort of looks a bit more approachable. You can get multiple types of yellow ackies. You can get high ends, you can get high reds, you can get high yellows, and you can get just normal drab animals. And then again with reds, you can get a low expression red, which still looks different to a yellow, but just don't get yourself sucked in. Just because it's a red animal doesn't mean it's a red ackie. Normally reds are a lot more expensive than yellows, so the price will be your indicator there. So ackies tend to get between 24 and 28 inches long. 20 inches is common. My big male, who's an absolute unit, is 26 inches. And it's expected for them to live about 15 to 20 years in captivity with correct care. So that is just a basic overview of the ackie. So for setups, right, here we go. So the minimum recommended is a 4x2x2, which is 120 centimeters by 60 centimeters by 60 centimeters. I had ackies in 4x2s when I first got ackies, and I learned quite quickly that for me is too small. I'd recommend a minimum of 5x2x3, 2 deep, 3 tall, but ideally 5x3x3 if you can. And that's 150 centimeters by 60 centimeters by 90 centimeters. And the reason I say this is a 4x2x2 for a 2 and a bit foot lizard who's incredibly active. Ideally, we'll get onto substrate in a minute, but ideally wants a deep layer of substrate, if not a big nest box. The big nest box is going to take up half the cage if you've only got them in a 4x2x2. So if you can go 4x2x3 tall, that gives you a bit more room to play. You can get a nice deep nest box in there or a nice deep layer of substrate and still have the minimum of the 4x2x2. I currently have one of mine who I introduce my male to every now and then as 6x2x2, and I have one of mine in a 4x3x2. And again, like I say, I don't want to be a contradiction and I want to be completely transparent. I do think that the 4x3x2 is too small and I need to get at least 5 foot long. But I've managed to make use of all the spare space. So every little area there's either a piece of cork or a branch or there's something, so it's not just dead space. So I think that's very important when you're setting up your enclosure. Make sure that all the space is used, especially if it's a smaller enclosure. Make the most of that, like elevated areas. But again, if you've already got a lizard and it's in a 4x2x2, you're in the boat of many. If and when you can, I'd recommend to upgrade. If you've not got your lizard and you're looking to get one, don't think a 4x2x2 is where you're going to be. Trust me, you're going to want to be bigger. You're going to want to be 6x2x2 or 5x2x3 or 5x3x3. Trust me, you and your ackie will definitely benefit from that. So then inside the cage with the lighting, 100%, I don't care what anyone says, T5 UVB, 12 to 14% depending on how tall your viv is away from your basking spot. You ideally want to aim for a UVI, so the index between 4 and 6, and then tailoring out into the lower ends into the cage. So ideally you definitely want somewhere in the cage where there's a UVI of 0, so that'd be either a burrow or a nice buried hide. And then you want on the basking spot somewhere between 4 and 6. Mine, I've got one on around 5 and one around 5.5, which you can check with a solar meter 6.0 or 6.5, sorry. Definitely worth investing in just so you can get more life out of your UVB. But 100% monitors they're sun worshipping animals, they definitely need UVB. 100% get UVB on them. I also recommend over the top of that as well with a 6500 LED, and this will basically replicate sunlight. So alongside the UVB, you've got either I use LED floodlights or LED battens. I'm an electrician by trade, so I sort of can find cheaper ones. But 6,500 Kelvin, which is equivalent of like daylight in the level of lux. Well, I'm not going to go into the science of it, but 6,500 LED, definitely. Like I say, I'm sort of experimenting myself at the moment. I've got a little floodlight on top of one of my ackies, and then I've got a long LED batten on top of my other Ackie. I'm just looking behind me to check the Ackie. I prefer the little floodlights, to be honest. They're 20 watt, just off Amazon. I think they were £30 for two, so no reason at all why not to get them. Brightens up the cage, and I think you see a lot more increased activity since I've added them. Right, next, basking spots. So you're going to have, if you've based on a 4-foot enclosure, I would recommend, ideally you want basking spot to cover the length of the animal. So if you've got a 2-foot animal, you need 1 or 2 bulbs that are going to cover the length of your animal, so it's not sat under a basking site and it's just getting hotter and hotter and hotter until like that little area gets a burn just so the rest of its body can get hot. So ideally you either want a dome or a couple of basking bulbs or a nice wide angle flood to get you that desired basking spot. Sorry if you can hear Mango in the background. But yeah, so you want a 2-foot LED, 2-foot LED, 2-foot T5 UVB, best podcast ever. You want a 2-foot T5 LED and you want a 2-foot T5 UVB bulb going through the middle or to the side of your basking spots. So when your Ackie basks, it gets that benefit of the UVB. You also want an LED dedicated over the basking spot as well to increase that level of lux and light intensity so that animal gets as close to natural as possible. And I'd recommend you'd have an LED of 3 foot going across the viv just to give a bit of background light as well. For the basking spot, I personally aim between 55 and 65 degrees Celsius, and that's 131 or 150 degrees Fahrenheit. And the hot end, not on the basking spot, wants to be anywhere between 29 and 30 degrees Celsius, which is 84 to 100 degrees Fahrenheit. The cool side, you want anywhere between 24 and 30 degrees Celsius, which is 75 to 86 degrees Fahrenheit. This is very important that the animal has a thermal gradient. Once they eat, they can get nice and hot and sit under the basking spot, digest that food, very, very important for them. But then they can also disappear off into a burrow or something like that. That's going to get them nice and cool so they don't overheat. Nighttime temperature, controversial topic, but I let mine go down to 19, 20 degrees Celsius. They don't have any nighttime heat, which is around 68 degrees Fahrenheit. And in the winter, they get as cold as 15 degrees Celsius, which is 60 degrees Fahrenheit. I've been doing this now for a couple of years and I haven't seen any ill effects. I've also seen a lot of people recommend to go down to like a nice low temperature. And it basically stimulates the seasons in the wild. In the winter, they have a tad of a cool off period. Not quite a brumation, but they'll have a month or two where they just aren't as active and the days are a bit shorter and colder and the nights are definitely colder. At me if you think it's wrong, but that's what I do, so I think that works quite well. So like I say, with the changes in seasons, I allow the summer to get, my room gets hot, the summer gets hot, the basking spots stay the same for me, but the viv overall temperature gets hotter. And in the winter, the basking spot again, I try and keep the same, but the viv overall gets cooler. And this change in temperature will basically spur on your breeding cycle. So when it gets colder and then starts to heat back up, the animals go, okay, I've had that little bit of a cool off period, it's now spring, it's time to breed. That cool off period as well can help like how fertile your male is and how fertile your females are. So I definitely recommend that you give them that little cool period, regardless if you're doing it to stop like as much food or if you're trying to breed or not, but allow our seasons to give you hot and then give you cold. Just it's closer to nature, replicates nature. If you want to give nighttime temperature and you're worried, if you want to give a nighttime heat source because you're worried about the temperature, then that's completely fine. But I don't give mine any heat at all. My room stays relatively hot. I keep a few lizards, but like I say, sometimes it goes down to 15 and I don't worry about it. But again, it's very important that you get a nice hot basking spot for your ackies, because it allows them to digest their food properly, and it will stop you having any of the ill effects that we spoke about earlier in the podcast. So now for substrate. If you're still here, thank you very much. I'm still getting used to this podcast life, so all the mistakes, it's just part and parcel of it, I guess. But I'm hoping that people are finding value from this. So again, I'm really appreciative that people are listening, if anyone's listening. So substrate, I use play sand and topsoil with a little bit of eco earth. The whole point is to mix it so it's enabled to hold a burrow. So you want the top layer to be nice and dry, because you don't want ackies sitting in damp substrate, because they could get bumblefoot and too much humidity can cause issues. But then you also don't want the substrate to be dry, so when they dig in it, it's not flicking everywhere and it's not dust. So you want them to dig down, and you want that to be able to hold a burrow. Another good technique to do this is if you use water to saturate the substrate and you have like leaf litter on top, that leaf litter will act as a barrier from the heat, keeping the humidity into the substrate, but then keeping the top layer nice and dry. And if you're going for a bioactive route, eventually the leaves will break down, add into your substrate and give you a good core base of substrate, mixing all that leaf litter in, allowing the microfauna to feed and basically helping aid your soil in life, so you haven't got to change it out as regularly. So a couple of ways to do this: either have a nice deep substrate of around a foot to 18 inches, or have a nice shallow substrate of 4 to 6 inches so they can still dig and bury themselves. But you definitely want to have a dig/nest box, regardless if it's a male or a female. I say this because ackies are naturally burrowers. They'll burrow down into the wild. They'll burrow down in the wild and they'll find a nice humid retreat. So it's very important that we replicate this into our captive husbandry. It's also very good for their mental health and their enrichment. I'm just reading my notes to see back where I'm going. So the nest box size that I use is 2 foot by 1 foot by 1 foot. And it's very important to heat your substrate or your nest box, because if you've got a female and she does have eggs, and she'll have eggs regardless if you have a male or not, and she's trying to find a nice heated spot where she can lay her eggs, and ideally that heated spot would be between 84 and 88 degrees Fahrenheit, and I'm not sure what that is in Celsius off the top of my head, but 26 to 30, something like that, 32, something like that. So basically you want to heat it. You can either do this via a vivarium below, or you can do this from a nice high powered heat lamp from above, or you can do this on a heat mat on a stat. But the heated soil is incredibly important. I'm just going to have a drink. Might even edit this bit out, but I might not. I'm probably not. So if you don't have deep substrate, nest box. If you don't have a nest box, deep substrate. But it has to be heated. Otherwise, sorry, my mangrove's knocking down her lights. Has to be heated, otherwise you could end up with a dead lizard, and we definitely don't want that. So what else? Rocks. Rocks are incredibly good to aid in the shedding process, as well as again climbing on, giving them that mental enrichment. And a rock under a basking spot with nice halogen bulbs will get nice and hot, allowing your ackie to basically thermoregulate. It can pick where it wants to be, so you can have what's called a reed stack, which is basically, I'm sure everyone's seen them, but it's basically slate or wood that goes to multiple layers, and the ackie the bulb will sit on top and shine down and through, and the Ackie can basically pick wherever it wants to sit, at the very, very top, the hot spot, or it can work it all the way down, so it's a lot cooler, but also it can thermoregulate just as it needs. If not, this can be achieved just by a cluster of rocks, as what they would be found out on the wild. Cork and branches. For me, ackies are not semi-arboreal, but they definitely love to climb. So by adding cork bark and some branches, it gives them again a lot more enrichment and a lot more to do, and you can always move these around, and then the Ackie will always be sort of curious and looking around and what's this and where's that and why have you moved it, and sort of figuring out their environments. And it's simple little tricks like that that just keep your Ackie from being bored, really, because if you turn up to the same place every day like most of us do, it sucks. So mix it all up. Some plants, if you want your plants to get destroyed, get live plants, and then they'll uproot them like the little bulldozers that they are. Or fake plants. Again, it's just something simple to add into the cage. It's just that bit of enrichment, that bit of mental stimulus. You can pick whatever ones you want, really. They're just not expensive, because otherwise they'll ruin all your hard work. But it's more aesthetic for us, but it definitely helps in the enrichment for them. The more stuff they have to sort of dig around in and under. Sometimes what I like to do is just pull a load of grass from the garden, pop that in there. It slowly dries and wilts away, but it looks really cool, and it just gives them new smells and new textures. So simple stuff like that. Water. Right. They definitely need water. Anyone that says they don't listen to. They need water. Fresh water. Ideally daily, but most to many of us aren't that good, myself included. So I try to do at least 3 to 4 times a week water change. Just a little water bowl, ideally big enough for your Ackie to get into, just in case. But 3 to 4 times a week, fresh, clean water. I personally spray my Ackies once a week on a Sunday. It doesn't have to be a lot. It's just enough just to get them just a bit of humidity, just up the humidity of the air. And then throughout the winter period, I spray them every 4th night, maybe an hour before the lights go off, just to spike that humidity. It's just basically, for me, it gets cooler, there's more humidity. So that's the main reason I do it. Some people don't believe in spraying your Ackies. I do. I spray them definitely at least once a week, and sometimes every 4 to 5 days. Excuse me. So yeah, I spray my Ackies regularly, or a lot more regularly than people would like. Not as much as my Indonesian stuff, but I spray them once a week. And this also helps the soil to keep its humidity. I don't... every 2 to 3 weeks I put a pitcher of water into the substrate, and I'll turn it a bit just to see sort of what my levels are, make sure it's still holding a burrow and everything's fine. So, but humidity, you want to aim around 50% humidity ambient, and then around 80 to 100 if you can get it, but between 80 and 90% in the burrows / humid hides. Like I say, you want that substrate nice and dry on top, and you want it nice and humid and not wet, but definitely able to hold a burrow down below. And you can achieve this easier if you put some sort of bark or leaf litter over the top of your substrate. That just allows that substrate dam as such, just to help them sort of hold its humidity. So we touched on it briefly, but mental health of the Ackie is incredibly important. Monster lizards are incredibly smart. They get bored incredibly easy. It's very important to do silly little changing up of the enclosure just by moving branches, moving logs, adding that grass, changing the way that you feed them, getting them a dog toy, getting them a puzzle, just adding a new branch, just anything simple just to keep their brain turning. I try and do something at least once a week for my Ackies and all my monitors, even if it's just something as just cutting a hole in a bottle and putting the food in that, so they have to knock the bottle around to get the food out. Just something simple. But I think mental health in Ackies is incredibly overlooked. Mental health in monitor lizards is incredibly overlooked. If you think how easily we get bored just going to the same place doing the same things, listening to this podcast, for example, you you'd put yourself in the lizard shoes. You're just in a 4x2x2 box every day. There's just a bit of dirt on the floor of a rock. So it's very important just to keep them entertained, keep them enriched, even just getting them out or working with them and socialising them. That again is enrichment. That's basically that little bit of interaction that just gets their brain going. Just keeps them from being depressed really. So, and we're going to touch on food now. Variety is key. Ackies are insectivorous, but I'm sure in the wild they'd pick off the odd rodent, avian, and even reptilian. Here in captivity, especially in the UK, we can't feed live, but I'd love to have feeder geckos. Just basically, I'm going to have another drink 'cause my throat, I'm so really sorry guys, but I'm not well at the moment, so bear with me. Best podcast ever, I know. So, variety is key. I feed mine a combination of Morio or superworms, locusts, pactinata grubs, the sunbeetle larvae, crickets, locusts, roaches, Morio, superworms, normal earthworms. They get the odd pinky, but only as a treat, or if my females have just laid. But again, I think feeder lizards would be key if I could source some ethically. But again, we're not supposed to live feed here in the UK. But I think lizards would be a trick. So trying to find a food source similar to lizards, so probably birds, but defeathered, wouldn't be the worst thing in the world. But just variety. If you fed one thing one day, feed again 4, 5, 6 days later, but switch it up. Don't just feed them back to back to back the same thing, because they'll get either one, very used to it and they won't want to eat other food, or two, they'll get very bored of it. But on to feeding. How often? My babies that are freshly hatched and a couple of weeks old, some are now 6.5 weeks old, they get fed pretty much every day. If there's not locusts in there, or there's not crickets in there, or if the roaches have disappeared from the bowl, I'll feed them again. So I make sure they have food on hand 24/7. My adult male, I feed him, it's sporadic really, so some weeks he'll get fed 3 or 4 times, 4 or 5 items. Some weeks he'll get fed once, 4 or 5 items. Next week he'll get fed once, 15, 20 items. It just basically depends and varies really where he is. I basically judge it on him and his lateral folds. He's a bit podgy at the moment, to be honest, so he's getting fed a bit less and a bit more leaner foods. But yeah, there's no rhyme or reason the way that I feed. I basically just feed when I think he needs food, and then I'll give him 2 or 3 days off, and then I'll feed him again, and then I'll give him 7 to 10 days off, and then I'll give him a bit bigger meal. So I don't worry too much if I have missed a food with him. My females is completely different, because if I'm trying to breed them, I'll make sure that they're fed pretty much every other day, and if they're gravid, they get fed every day, and I try them multiple times a day just to make sure that they are eating and getting substance. But you just have to judge your animal really. It's very easy to overfeed them, so I try not to. My male came to me and he was a little bit overweight. He was in good shape, but he was a little bit overweight. I think he was fed a bit too high protein diet, so I've been trying to slim him down since having him for nearly 2 years now. So, but yeah, and then multivitamin and calcium. I do supplement both with my feeders for all my monitors. I don't do it in every single meal unless it's a female who's gravid. She will get calcium in every meal, but I would do 1 multivitamin, then 1 calcium, then none, then calcium, then none, then multivitamin, then calcium. Sort of works like that. So they'll get 2 or 3 multivitamins a month, 4 or 5, maybe 6 calciums a month. And I don't personally use D3 because for me, if you're giving the correct level of UVB, they can synthesize it themselves and it is easy to overload them on D3. So I don't personally give with D3, I give calcium without D3, and I have a solar meter just to check that my UVB is all in order, so that ideally the animal can metabolize that calcium into D3 for itself. There was a study done that I haven't read, but hopefully I'll get him on here soon. Ben Miles, you've probably seen him on Facebook, keeps the Varanus UNAI. He was telling me that animals that get more calcium spend less time under the UVB and basking, and animals that spend more time basking, and the animals that get more calcium spend less time basking under the UV. So it's an interesting study that hopefully one day me and him can speak about on here. But also, when it comes to feeding, make sure that your insects are gut loaded. Gut loading your insects is the number one important thing that you can do for your Ackie, because you are what you eat. And if you're eating a dehydrated, hungry cricket or locust or roach, then what's the point really? You're just eating a shell. So if you're buying your bugs from a pet shop, put them into a big stacker box, give them a nice array of food, gut load. There's multiple gut loads you can buy, or just buy, like my roaches, they get gerbil food. I feed my roaches gerbil food and salads. So if you can breed your own, then you know what's in them and what they've been raised on. But yeah, definitely hydrate your bugs for 24 to 48 hours, gut load them for 24 to 48 hours, and then feed them off. Don't just get home from the pet shop and feed them off, because there's no substance there. Even at the best pet shops, the bugs come in dehydrated, and it's very important for hydration of your lizard to make sure that the bugs are hydrated. So, if you're still with me, thank you. So basically, we're just going to go over a little bit of socialisation now, and then I'm going to wrap this up, and I'm sure that you're all glad of it. So I'm hopefully found a bit of, what's the word I'm thinking of? Value in this podcast. And sorry for all the, I'm a bit unwell, and I've sort of left it to the last day, just because I've been feeling a bit down, to be honest. So, but here we are, recording it nonetheless for my 50 viewers, who I greatly, deeply appreciate. But yeah, so once you get your Ackie, it's very important to establish that trust. Don't just go in there, pick him out, dig him up, wherever he or she may not be. Oh my God, I've lost my Ackie. Where is she? Dig through the cage trying to find it. We're all guilty of it. I'm guilty of it. With my babies, I'm like, oh my God, I've only seen 7 of them today. I need to dig them out. So don't, because that just imprints on that Ackie, and it just thinks you're a monster. So especially when you're just a little lizard, and when you come from Australia, everything's going to eat you. So just do everything on their terms. Try and tongue feed. Food is the key. Once they start to tongue feed, you can lure them out with your hand. They'll learn quite quickly that you mean them no stress, no trouble, no drama, and you're the bringer of food. So the chances are when you come in, they'll come out because they're wanting to get fed. I'm currently trying to target train a couple of my guys, not necessarily my Ackie, but my Indicus, just again on that next level of sort of socialisation, because every time I open the door, she's either thinking she's getting fed, so she's got a crazy food response, or she's not, and then she just wants to get defensive. So if I show said monitor lizard a green ball, they know that they're getting fed. If they don't see the green ball, then they know it's interaction time, and hopefully they can distinguish like the difference between the two, and you can distinguish the mode that they're in, if they're in a inquisitive thinking mode, or if they're in a food mode, because the easiest way to get bit is in a food mode. But like I say, everything on your Accie's terms, everything the way that they see it fit. The chances are, if you've got an Ackie from a relatively good breeder, they probably will be quite socialised anyway. Not that they have time to sort of tame and work them down, but the chances are that the breeders have been working with them, and they get to know that the human as such brings food. So once the Ackie gets used to its new environment, which we should probably touch on, once you get an Ackie, regardless of its age, if you put it into an environment that's completely alien, it doesn't know where it is, it's all new smells, it's all new temperatures, it's all new surroundings, it's all new noises. Don't stress if you don't see it for a week or two, and don't stress if it doesn't eat for a week or two, because the chances are it's just settling in. Some come around a lot quicker than others, so don't compare yourself to others, because sometimes an Ackie will be out and feeding within a day, sometimes they'll disappear for 2 weeks. It's completely fine. Every time you see it, just double check it's not noticeably losing weight, and make sure there's food available at all times, just in case it wants to eat when you're not around. Don't try and tongue feed it straight away. Make sure that it's eating first, and then you can try and tongue feed. And again, it's just about taking baby steps. Slowly tongue feed. If it doesn't want to tongue feed, fine, but don't force the food in its face. Don't over egg it. Don't overdo it. Just tongue feed. If it wants to come out, it wants to come out. It'll take the food. Eventually you can lure it onto your hand. Eventually you can start to touch it whilst it eats. And eventually it's just going to want to actually seek you out for attention. I think I've pretty much covered everything. I've been rambling now for nearly 36 minutes. So, again, thank you so much for listening. Hopefully you found some value in this. If you've got any questions in regards to ackies, either drop it in the comments, or if there's anything you'd like me to do next, drop it in the comments, or shoot me a message on Instagram. Again, I'm at Paul's Monitors. Yeah, well, I appreciate everyone for listening. And if you made it this far, let me know. Just leave a comment that says ackies for life, and then I'll know. I look forward to seeing none of those comments. Alright, cheers guys.